Hello and welcome to Norwood Wesleyan Church online. This is Pastor Phillip Telfer and I'm glad you could join us. Our church in Edmonton, Alberta is dedicated to reaching for God together. We welcome you along on the journey and we hope our time together encourages you toward a more meaningful and personal relationship with God. You may have caught it last week that I'm convinced that we have some of the world's best volunteers. Did you hear that last week? We do. I think we do. We have some of the world's best volunteers at this very church. So congratulations on being one of the world's best volunteers, if that's you, or being treated by some of the world's best volunteers. If you come as a visitor today, it'd be easy for me to spend a whole message just talking and praising our volunteers, and we do reserve a couple Sundays every year to celebrate our volunteers and to encourage people to become volunteers. But today I'm not going to take time to talk about each person that volunteers here. I want to praise one person in particular, and she's a woman who has recently stepped up to take over the treasurer position at this church. The lady's name is Joanne. She's standing in the back. She's also hosting today, so we thank her for that as well. Yeah. I'd like to personally and publicly thank her for helping our church in the area of financial health. Thank you, Joanne. She spends a lot of hours behind the scenes with me, working through numbers, and we spent quite a bit of time last week crunching some numbers together in the office. And after quite a few hours, it was about lunchtime, and Joanne has unfortunately found out that Philip doesn't really take lunch. So she was forcing the break, and so she stood up saying, I'm going to take a break. So it's about noon, so she stood up to take a break. She went to open the door, and she said it was locked. I said, just twist it. She's like, no, it's unlocked, but it's locked. So she was twisting the knob, but the door was not opening. There was something wrong with the handle. It was jammed. The latch was jammed. And so Joanne and I were stuck in the office last week, 2 weeks ago now, and that was interesting. I spent about 15 minutes jiggling and trying to mess with the door, fidgeting with the door handle, and I ended up climbing out the window of the office, grabbing tools from my vehicle, and then climbing back into the office through the window and using the tools to take off and remove the handle from the office door so that I could release Joanne from our little crisis there. So she was patient. Thankfully, we had Alex, the PowerPoint Pro, on the other side of the door. Yeah, so he helped us as well. So thank you, Alex. Thank you, Joanne. Believe it or not, Joanne is still our treasurer. She didn't quit on the spot, so that was really good. I was really happy for that. So, yeah. So she did say that she was joking about never wanting to be in the office again with the door closed, and I can't blame her for that. So I will offer that up. But she's a trooper. And my guess is that most of us know what it feels like to be locked in or to be locked out. We know what that feels like, right? Many of us probably know what both of those situations feel like. We've been locked in certain places and we've been locked out of certain places as well. And neither feel great. Being locked in and being locked out are moments of crisis. Those are moments that require a decision to be made. A crisis point is a decision point. It's like a pivotal moment in your life, a situation that demands a strategic response, careful response, maybe immediate response. Crisis point. Now, one of our goals as a church is to read through the story of the Bible in 2019. And last month we began by looking at the first book, the book of Genesis. And one of the things that we reviewed was this human gift of free will, the power that we have received that enables us to make decisions in life. It's a powerful gift. It's the most powerful gift that we have, the power to choose. The choices that we make are especially critical when we find ourselves in these moments of crisis, these pivotal moments in our lives, because the decisions that we make in those moments have the power to alter the direction of our lives and to determine where we go and who we become. A crisis often brings along with it the sense of danger, a sense of difficulty, and a sense of distress, like being locked in an office with Joanne or with Philip, or being locked out of a vehicle or a warm building this week especially, right? We spend much time outside this week. We're going to experience very quickly some difficulty, some distress, and if we stay out there too long, we might even encounter some death, right? It's danger. Some danger out there this week. To be locked in, to be locked out, it can be a crisis, a moment of crisis that can bring this danger to our lives. Crisis is a key theme that is found in the life story of a man named Joseph. That's where we're going today. The first book of the Bible is where we find Joseph's story. It's recorded in Genesis chapter 35 through 50. It's kind of a drawn-out story. It's a beautiful story. It's a roller coaster of a story. So as we engage with the story of Joseph today, let's listen carefully for the presence of crisis, and let's look at the power of human decisions, the presence of crisis and the power of human decisions. Before I start summarizing the story of Joseph, let's take a minute to look at the family of Joseph. Now, Joseph had a dad, like most people do, right? Joseph had a dad, and Joseph's dad was a guy named Jacob. Now, Jacob had a dad as well. Jacob's dad was a guy named Isaac. Now, Isaac had a dad, and Isaac's dad was a guy named Abraham. Abraham, yeah. So Abraham was Joseph's great-grandfather. This matters. It matters because, as you may remember, that Abraham claimed to have received a special promise from God to bless him and to bless all nations through him. That was the promise God gave to Abraham. And because of this big promise, Abraham's family becomes a big deal, including Joseph. We're going to find out more on this later as we track through the story of Joseph. Now, Joseph was not his father's only child. He was actually far from it. He was the 11th son in the family. The 11th, that's a lot of boys. But he was Jacob's favorite son. So even though he was the 11th, he was the favorite. In addition to showing Joseph some special treatment, Jacob, Joseph's dad, gave Joseph a special gift that sparked some jealousy from his brothers. It was a special coat that he gave to Joseph. This was one of many things that kind of played into this favoritism that Joseph grew up receiving from his dad. Now, Joseph actually stirs the pot with this favoritism that he receives from his dad. He stirs the pot by sucking up to his dad and kind of throwing his brothers under the bus at different points. It says at the beginning of chapter 35, I believe, 37 of Genesis 37. It says that he would tell bad stories. He would kind of tattletale on his brothers and stir that pot. So not a good deal going on for Joseph and the response that he has to this favoritism. So the first season of Joseph's life is this lifting up, that he's being lifted up in favoritism. So that's our first point. He's being lifted up in favoritism, and there's some crisis that's kind of brewing around the edges of the story already. There's some tension between his brothers and him. And one day, Joseph actually shares a dream that he has of his brothers and his whole family bowing down to him, and that doesn't go over very well with anybody. Actually, his whole family is now mad at him. There's tension increasing in this relationship that Joseph has with his brothers and now his parents as well. The story made the whole family upset, especially his brothers, who already were jealous of him. In Genesis chapter 37, verse 4, it says, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him. Speaking of Joseph's brothers, they hated Joseph. They hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. So in a sense, after Joseph is being lifted up in favoritism, he's beginning to become locked out of his family. Joseph was gradually being locked out of the family circle, especially with his brothers. He's getting locked out of the family. And now, so crisis it's not only simmering, it's starting to boil in Joseph's life. Now, one day, Jacob sends Joseph out to check on his brothers who were watching the sheep or the animals in the fields. And so he did. Joseph goes out and he checks on his brother, and it sets up this pivotal decision for his brothers. In chapter 37, verse 18, the brothers see Joseph coming, and it says, but they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. So they hated him so much, they wanted him dead. So they plotted to kill him, Joseph, as he's coming to check on the brothers. These brothers hated Joseph so much that they threw him in an empty well where they planned to leave him to die. So Joseph he's locked out of the family. That's the second point. He's getting locked out of the family. So we can go to the next. Yeah, there we go. Nice. Nailed it. Beautiful. So the brothers, they hated him. They throw him in this well. And then they sit down to have some lunch while Joseph's probably screaming from the well because they're hungry, right? And they know how to take breaks. So they sit back and they have some lunch, and then they see this caravan of merchants kind of traveling by. And they end up changing their minds. They say, okay, well, let's, instead of just leaving Joseph here to die, let's get something out of the deal. We can sell Joseph as a slave to these cats as they cross over, and we can get some money out of the deal and get rid of our punk brother. So they saw it as a win-win, so they do it. They change their mind. They pull him out of the well. They sell him to these Ishmaelites, these merchants that are traveling by, and they sell him as a slave. And these merchants were bound for Egypt. They sell him for 200 grams of silver, which is roughly $2,000 today. And now, if nobody sees any crisis, I don't know if maybe you can see very well, or if you can't sense it. It's happening. There's a lot of crisis already happening in Joseph's story, and we're still kind of in the beginning of the story, which is pretty intense. So the third stage, or the third season that we see in Joseph's story, is that he is lifted from the grave just to almost immediately be locked into slavery. So there's a quick lifting and then another locking season that's going on in his life. Chapter 39 of Genesis, verses 1 through 6 tell the story. It says, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. So now the merchants, they took him to Egypt. They arrive. A guy named Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. And it says, the Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of this Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything that he owned. So this guy buys a slave, and he's giving him a promotion within this slave setup. Puts him in charge of everything that he owns. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything that Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care, and with Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. So apparently Joseph couldn't cook. I don't know. But he was a pretty good slave, and so he got all these promotions. And so the next season that we see is, although he's been locked into slavery, there's another lifting that takes place, and the lifting is that to a place of honor. He's lifted to a place of honor. Joseph was sold to the house of a guy named Potiphar, who was quickly impressed with Joseph's ability to work well. So he promotes him to the second in command of the whole household, all he owns. And Potiphar wasn't the only one impressed with Joseph. Potiphar's wife was also impressed by his physique. He was masculine, muscular, and attractive is kind of the description that we get from the Bible. And so Potiphar's wife takes note of this, and she starts to pursue Joseph for different reasons. She pursues him, and she tries to seduce him. One day she catches Joseph alone, but Joseph refused her invitation. He runs away from her. But as Joseph runs away, Potiphar's wife grabs his robe, pulls it off of him, and uses it to frame Joseph, claiming that Joseph was trying to sexually assault her. So she shares this story. People are like, oh my goodness, not Joseph, surely not. Some serious crisis now going on in Joseph's story. After listening to his wife's accusation, Potiphar has Joseph locked up in prison. So another season begins. So he was lifted to a place of honor. Now he's being locked up in prison. Genesis chapter 39, verse 20 says this. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison. And he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. There you go. During his years in prison, Joseph established a reputation as an interpreter of dreams. One day, Joseph was summoned by Pharaoh, the prime minister person of the day, and he was summoned for assistance with interpreting a troubling dream that this Pharaoh had. Before Joseph tried to explain anything, he was careful to clarify that God was the source of his interpretation skills, dream interpretation skills. Then he goes on to tell Pharaoh the meaning of the dream that he had. He says that there was going to be 7 years of healthy crops followed by 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh was so impressed with Joseph's ability to interpret his dream and the suggestions that came along after his interpretation. He suggested how to preserve food during the famine and during the crop times, the good crops, to make sure that they had enough for famine years. The Pharaoh was so impressed with this knowledge and wisdom that Joseph had that he gives him a position of honor as well, a position of power, of being in charge of managing the national food supply and food distribution, which is a huge deal for such a big world power at the time. That's basically in charge of the economy. So that's a lot of stuff on the line there, and Pharaoh is so impressed that he puts Joseph in charge of that position. Joseph had gone from being hated by his brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, imprisoned for a crime that he didn't commit, to being promoted to the second most powerful position in Egypt. That's the nutshell of most of Joseph's story. So this last season is that he's lifted to a position of power. And from this new role in Egypt, Joseph was able to reserve enough crops during the 7 good years so that they could be sold to feed people during the 7 years of famine. And during the famine, Joseph's father and his brothers start to get hungry. They start to run out of food, and so Joseph's father sends Joseph's brothers to Egypt to buy food for the family, not knowing that Joseph was there. After a runaround of emotional meetings, and I'm really kind of condensing the story here, there's a runaround of emotional meetings between Joseph and his brothers and this family dysfunction. After they do their thing, they dance around emotions for a bit. Joseph eventually revealed his identity to his brothers and welcomed his whole family to Egypt. His whole family, saving their lives and positioning them to receive the blessing that was promised to Abraham, his great-grandfather, 3 generations earlier. It's a pretty powerful story, the story of Joseph. It's quite the ride. You can actually read it for yourself. Genesis chapter 35 through 50 has most of it within those chapters in Genesis. I summarize the story today in order to highlight the flow of Joseph's story, some significant seasons within it. And I also summarize it to make sure that we're all out of here to catch the Super Bowl game later this afternoon, right? If we're not recording it. Look at the chapters, though. Let's check out the flow of Joseph's stories. We're going to keep these up here. The first one is that he is lifted up in favoritism. So he's the favorite son. He receives a special coat, special treatments, and that inspires or sparks the second season of becoming locked out of the family. He's ostracized by his brothers. He's hated by his brothers. He's thrown into an empty well to die. Number 3, he's lifted from the pit, from this grave, where he's going to be left to die. He's lifted from the grave just for a second, just to be sold right back into slavery, to be locked into slavery. Season number 4, he's lifted to a place of honor. He's honored in Potiphar's house. Even though he is a slave, he still finds favor and is promoted within that system. Number 5, he is falsely accused and unjustly imprisoned, so he's locked up in prison. And then finally, he's lifted to a place of power, where he eventually saves Egypt, his family, and allows God's story to continue through this lineage of Abraham, and this powerful, big promise to bless not only Abraham with a family, but to bless all nations through Abraham and his family. So there's a lot of ups and downs. It's a roller coaster. But for all of the change, all of the ups and downs, there seem to be 2 overall seasons in Joseph's story. The first one is a season of being lifted up, seasons of lifting. There's seasons of rejoicing, right? Good times, being promoted. And then there's seasons of being cut down, seasons of cutting, seasons of being rejected, seasons of remorse, and a lot of pain going on in his life, a lot of confusion. The timing of these seasons appear to be random until we notice something consistent behind the scenes. That consistency in Joseph's story, despite the ups and downs along the way, is God's presence with Joseph. God was with Joseph the whole time. God was with him in Jacob's family, allowing him to prosper, allowing him to be the favorite son, allowing him to gain the favor that he needed. God was with him in Potiphar's house, which is why he prospered and he gains favor there. In Genesis chapter 39, verse 2, it says, the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. This is in Potiphar's house. He receives favor, not only with God, but also with man. God was with Joseph in prison, again, allowing him to prosper and gain favor in the eyes of the prison warden, which it tells us in Genesis 39, 20 and 21. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the sight of the prison warden. God was with him in his dream interpretation, a gift inspired and released by God himself, is what Joseph shared with people. He kind of used it as a preface every time he interprets a dream. He's like, oh, just know this isn't me, this is God working through me. So this was God's favor, God's presence with Joseph that allows him to interpret dreams, even the dream of the Pharaoh. This is why which brings him more. He's prospering again. He's gaining more favor, even in the eyes of the leader of the land, the prime minister of the day, basically. This guy named Pharaoh. That was his position. God was with Joseph the whole time, causing him to become the favorite kid, and the favorite slave, the favorite prisoner, and finally Pharaoh's favorite right-hand man. He's the favorite, right? A lot of favor coming because of Joseph's presence, or God's presence with Joseph. And Joseph was aware of God's presence with him. He knew that God was with him. In Genesis chapter 45, verses 4 through 8, when he reveals his identity to his brothers 22 years later after they sold him into slavery, Joseph shares this. In verses 4 through 8 of chapter 45, he tells his brothers, Joseph speaking, I am your brother, Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. The story of Joseph's life, obviously we see him sold by men. But behind the scenes, he's being sent by God. Powerful decisions being made all across the board. The flow of Joseph's story is a series of lifting and cutting. And this lifting and cutting is like the creation of a key. If you think about how a key is made, there's cutting involved, there's lifting involved. There's two main directions in which we cut a key. But at the end of the story, there's a powerful product. The flow of Joseph's story is like the creation of a key that has a combination of specific cuts and timely rises that position Joseph to unlock a massive political door in the middle of a famine that saved the lives of his entire family. Now, the thing about keys is that they won't work without specific cuts. Without the pit, how would Joseph have survived long enough to be sold to the merchants? Without the slave traders, how would Joseph have made it to Egypt? Without the being purchased by Potiphar, how would Joseph have received training and experience that he got under Potiphar's watch? Without the false accusation and the unjust imprisonment, how would Joseph have ended up in Pharaoh's presence? And without the famine, how would Joseph's family have been reunited? Keys won't work without specific cuts. Keys also won't work without timely rises, very precise rises. Without the favoritism of Jacob, how would Joseph have been hated by his brothers? Without being lifted from the pit, how would Joseph have made it to Egypt? The timing of that caravan, that was precise. That was huge. Without the slave traders lifting Joseph up for sale, how would Joseph have made it to Potiphar's house? Without Potiphar's favor, how would Joseph have learned all that he did? Without Pharaoh's dream interpretation, how would Joseph have gained his trust? Keys won't work without timely rises. Specific cuts, timely rises. But the biggest factor of Joseph's story was God's clear and consistent work in and around his life. For as many decisions, powerful decisions that were being made throughout this story of Joseph by so many different people that could have made very different decisions, for all of those decisions by all of those different people, God was behind the scenes cutting a specific key. In Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, Joseph shares this with his brothers. He says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." God was cutting the key. You were cutting me down, but God was cutting me in a way that was going to open this door to rescue you, right? God was cutting the key behind the scenes. The secret to Joseph's success was his strength of character. Character is revealed through storms, guys. We know our character when we face a storm. That's when we'll find out how strong we really are. Joseph didn't trust in his own abilities. He learned to trust in God's ability to redeem even the worst human decisions. Selling humanity, like sex trafficking, human exploitation, that's bad stuff. That's pretty dark stuff, right? Joseph trusted God to redeem even that. For all the repeated seasons of lifting and cutting, Joseph experienced one highly consistent season of righteousness. Righteousness is a big word, but it basically means right standing with God and with others. Right standing, right relationship. He had right relationship with God. He had right relationship with others, even for as much as they hurt him. He consistently maintained a strength of character that maintained this position or posture of right relationship with God and with other people. Even under extreme levels of betrayal and persecution and repeated temptation from this crazy lady, I don't know if she's crazy, sorry. Repeated temptation from Potiphar's wife, who was maybe highly neglected by Potiphar, and that's his issue, right? For whatever, he refuses the temptation. For all of that, he doesn't snap, he doesn't crackle, he doesn't even pop. He's staying strong for what he believes in. He refuses this temptation, and he keeps trusting God for good things, despite the ridiculous storms that swirl around him as you track through his story. He was also rewarded for it. This character was rewarded. As the key was cut, the doors began to open. Everywhere he went, favor upon favor, open door after open door, because of his consistent righteous character, his trust in God despite the storms. It took Joseph 22 years to crawl through character-building crises before his life was uniquely carved just right, and his keys were completely cut in such a way that allowed him to open the door for his family to be saved from a famine. I began the message with a story about getting stuck in an office with Joanne. It wasn't a nightmare, but it wasn't the best experience. For whatever reason, the door wouldn't open for us. It was unlocked, but it wouldn't open. And so I ended up climbing out the window. I got tools from my car. I climbed back in the window. I took off the door handle to open the door and to release Joanne so she didn't have to spend the rest of her days in the corner of our little church. Right? So you're welcome. But thank you for Grace that allowed me to do that as well. And thank you for Alex who helped us in that day. We didn't have to kick the door in, which has happened, I think, twice already in the time that I've been here. So we saved the door frame as well. Thankfully, we got the door opened. Joanne has survived. As you can see, she has bravely returned multiple times since our little incident, our little office crisis. And I don't share this story because I like to be embarrassed publicly. I share this story because it's an example of a small crisis. Not knowing how long we were going to be stuck together was uncomfortable, actually. Not knowing how we were going to get out was a little scary, actually, as well. Yeah. The only reason we got out was because we had the right keys. I used keys to open padlocks that were locking the window. I used keys to open my car. I grabbed a toolbox, it became a key box, and I used the tools as keys to remove the door handle and finally get past the office door that was jammed. The office crisis itself has now become a key of sorts, as it's helped us today. And I'm very thankful that it hasn't become a key reason for Joanne to leave the church, so that's good. Personal crisis can act like a lock in our lives. We experience it. We know what it feels like to be locked in, to be locked out. It's uncomfortable, it's scary. And that can act like a lock. That crisis can act like a lock in our lives. But Joseph's story encourages us to hope in the help of a good God who can transform our present crisis into a key for the future. A key that will be as strong as our character. If it's too weak, it's going to snap. It's going to break off. You cut that key too deeply, it's going to snap, right? If it's not strong enough, the character's not there, the integrity of the key's not there, it's just going to break off, it's not going to do its job. Character is huge. Character is the kicker. And that's because of God working in us. I realize that getting locked in a warm and safe place for an hour is nothing compared to being abused by a parent throughout childhood. It's nothing compared to being betrayed by the people that you love and trust the most. It's nothing compared to being evicted and having to make the streets your home, or feeling so much pain that addiction is easier to face than reality, or being so lonely and so depressed that pain feels like a friend somehow, and the thought of death becomes appealing. Personal crisis can become very dark and extremely destructive, like being rejected by your family, being sold into slavery, being falsely accused and unjustly imprisoned for years, 22 years. That was Joseph's story. And it is here in the reality of pain that I leave you with a challenge. The challenge is to collect the key beyond your crisis. Collect the key beyond your crisis. Patiently trust God to mold you during the difficult seasons, to equip you for the assignments ahead. Ask God to make today's crisis tomorrow's key. Invite God to carve the story of your life with precision, to redeem your deepest cuts with timely rises, to strengthen your character with each storm that strikes, to make you stronger for the storms that you face. Don't waste crisis, guys. Don't let it happen. Collect your keys. Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you for all that you do for us, and we do thank you for this gift of free will, the freedom to choose, this right to choose that you've given to each of us. And I thank you for redeeming wrong choices. I thank you for fixing unhealthy decisions that we and others continue to make over and over. I thank you for redemption. I thank you for restoration. I thank you for keys that can be cut from crisis, healing that can come from brokenness. And I just ask that you would continue to make that a reality for each of us, God, that you would continue to lead us into all that you have for us, bringing us through each storm as it comes, being with us through that storm, God, promoting us to whatever position you have for us. We trust you, we love you, and we thank you for all that you've done and all that you have to do in the days to come. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you for listening to Norwood Wesleyan Church online. If you ever find yourself in Edmonton, Alberta, I hope you can stop by for a worship service on Sunday morning at 11 a.m. And when you do, be sure to stay after for our family meal. This is Pastor Phillip Telfer, hoping you can join us again as we continue reaching for God together.